It's interesting because I teach also my other job. I teach at a Lutheran day school, and so 7th and 8th worldview is what I teach, and 5th and 6th religion. And I hated Zoom. You had to see the kids, but then the kids put on the masks and they do all those things. It's hard to teach that way. Oh, it was. No, but you did learn the technology, and it was useful. So I teach, my main thing that I teach on science, but I also teach, my primary area is worldview. My background is in philosophy and comparative religion, but I'm also a science nut. And so I usually train kids. I'll train them for and usually they range from high school into college, and I train them for about 9 months, and then we go and engage with other worldviews, like at UC Berkeley. And so they'll engage with other worldviews for about 20 hours. I even take kids down. We used to take them to Irvine when Dr. Francisco was at Irvine, and he actually took us to the largest mosque in Southern California. And it was interesting. He said, Scott, when we go in, he said, they are on the FBI watch list. I said, oh, cool. But they set us apart. The girls in my group were the only girls in the mosque. All the other girls were outside. They had set us apart. There were 3,500 worshipers that day. And the imam was from Egypt, and he came and talked to my students for about 2 hours after the service. So it was a good experience. But you're not here for that. We're here. This is a fascinating subject for me for a number of reasons, and we'll get into that. First, really quick, just in case, have you noticed that Christian organizations are getting sued a lot? We travel a lot, and so we just always, even though when you're doing a verbal lecture, you usually don't have to use the fair use, but we just want to make sure in case anybody videotapes anything along that line. So I'm from Grand Junction, Colorado. That's where our home base is. AOI has been around for about 40 years. And so this is one of the topics when I came in that I started doing my most research in, that in geology are the two areas that I most enjoy the most. And instead of how did dinosaurs fit into the Bible, I prefer, better yet, can the Bible explain? It seems like we try to fit the eisegesis kind of thing. So can we actually, from what we have in Scripture, can we make a good case for what we believe about dinosaurs? Okay? And so you can tell that when I first started this, I just started using PowerPoint. So moving things was really cool. And so I got all these little things. But then I thought probably it would get old real quick. So I stopped doing that as much. But the importance of the subject for me is basically, I left the faith intellectually in middle school. My parents didn't know. My parents are here. Ended up living most of my adult life, young adult life, as an atheist. I lived in the Bay Area. And the importance of the subject is because science and religion was the biggest thing. I was raised a Missouri Synod Lutheran. My identity was in my faith. But when I went to school, and of course we know, especially with the catechism, with delayed or deferred authority, we see the authority, and my parents sent me to a school. They were teaching me this. I trusted them. And when I started asking questions, no one had answers for me. And so what do you think when there's no answers, or they're not giving you any answers? Well, then we can't answer it. And even if you don't know it, you know, the law of non-contradiction, we know it naturally. It's just a way of thinking. We know that if this is true, something that says the opposite cannot be true as well. Dinosaurs was a big thing for me. How did they fit in? When did they die? Are they 65 million years? Was there death before sin? Were all these questions? And so I was one of those, and you can see that's why I went into philosophy. I like to think about some things that maybe other people didn't think about, but it disturbed me because what I was getting in school directly contradicted what I believed according to my faith. And if really the very beginning, you know, I'm not a good pick and chooser, you know, it's either all correct or it's not. And so the inerrancy of Genesis came into effect for me. And so I loved science. I loved digging into these things. But one of them was going to have to go. And so basically, I believed that everything I'd brought to this point was a lie. Now, I do give a talk about, and it's an apologetic talk about my descent, why I went, and how I came back. We don't have time for that because this is primarily about dinosaurs, okay? But I started seeing everything through evolutionary eyes. And Daniel Dennett, this book was not around when I was going through the difficulties I was going through, but I'm one of those that I always went to the source. So I read what atheists, I still do. I read more atheist books than I do Christian books. So I wanted to hear what they had to say. Well, he distills it very well because I think sometimes we don't understand the actual impact that evolution has as a complete worldview. And so he said, let me lay my cards on the table. If I were to give an award for the single best idea anyone ever had, I'd give it to Darwin, ahead of even Newton or Einstein and everyone else. In a single stroke, the idea of evolution by natural selection unifies the realm of life, meaning, and purpose, even though you can come to my next talk. Really, it invalidates any kind of meaning or purpose, but cause and effect mechanism and physical law. He put forth later an analogy. He said universal acid is a liquid so corrosive that it will eat through anything. The problem is, what do you keep it in? He says, little did I realize that in a few years I would encounter Darwin's idea, bearing unmistakable likeness. It eats through just about every traditional concept. It does. Now, fortunately, most people don't think through their assumptions to their limit, or else we'd have a lot more really bad stuff. We have enough bad stuff. But he goes through, in my life at this time, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Albert Camus. He was a nihilist existential writer. One of the books he wrote was called The Myth of Sisyphus. And Sisyphus is from Greek mythology. He was cursed to roll a rock up a hill just to have it roll back down. It was a meaningless task. So he had an essay called An Absurd Reasoning, and he said there's but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Judging whether life is or is not worth living amounts to answering the fundamental question of philosophy. That is where I was. At the end, my life had gone, ended up overdosing. I was in a lockdown for 8 weeks. In that, there was one guy. Actually, he was a Catholic priest, and if you look at the Catholic Catechism, he believed contrary. He was a creationist. He started asking me questions, and so really, that was what started me back. I'm not sure if any of you have read Screwtape Letters, but I love this part, because I think sometimes we think science is opposed to our faith. And if you look at the history of science, if it wasn't for the idea of a lawgiver, you wouldn't have the science that we have in Western society, or at least not developed the way it did. But he says, keep pressing home. So Screwtape is writing to the lesser demon, and he said, keep pressing on him the ordinariness of things. Above all, do not attempt to use science, I mean the real sciences, as a defense against Christianity. They will positively encourage him to think about realities he can't touch and see. There have been sad cases among modern physicists. And of course, it's kind of set in the light, the enemy in the Screwtape's letter is God. So he's talking about that if you look at true science, it actually will bring you to an understanding or a deeper appreciation. And he started asking me questions, which was really good. And I'm sorry, I get cotton mouth really bad sometimes. So, number one reason kids give for deserting the faith is evolution. It really is that large of a subject. And it's getting really, the animosity is increasing. You know, Richard Dawkins, it's absolutely safe to say that if you meet somebody who claims not to believe in evolution, that person is ignorant, stupid, or insane. He goes on to say, or something worse, but I'd rather not consider that. And so a lot of the times when we as Christians, we look like the nutty professor. We look like the guy when we try to. So we need to be able to back what we say about dinosaurs, about geology, with evidence, okay? And we have to be able to look at the evidence in the proper way, okay? We all have the same data, and what we're going to do, because you can't truly prove historical things the way most people want them to be proven, you can do what's called abductive reasoning, or reasoning to the best conclusion. It's a forensic reasoning. And what you do is you try to understand, and what we're going to do here is we're going to look at predictive abilities, and then what we're going to do is then we're going to kind of reverse engineer into the assumptions that we have. Which set assumptions actually gives us an accurate reality that we're living today according to looking at true scientific evidence, because it's really just a wrestling over the data. I know you guys have heard this before, but worldviews very much are like glasses. Those assumptions shade. Okay, and a lot of our assumptions, it's fine to have things that we assume to be true. The thing is, when we have contrary evidence, do we then test them? Do we look at it? And so whether it's evolution or creation, really looks at how we can evaluate that evidence. And again, for me, the main issue came back to, and a large case was beginning with dinosaurs. Okay? And it's interesting, it says, time is in fact the hero of the plot. This is George Wald. It says, given so much time, the impossible becomes possible, the possible probable, and the probable virtually certain. One only has to wait. Time itself performs miracles. This is truly the underlying idea, but when we think about it, you know, it almost causes, because it's almost incomprehensible to think about immeasurable time. And I think sometimes that gives the impression of profundity. And so a lot of the time students will look at that and go, yeah, I guess that is possible. I can't even comprehend a million years. Yeah, I guess anything is possible. And so I usually give this example. I'm not, as you can probably tell from my physique, I'm not a biker, but if I was a biker, I could possibly ride, 300,000 kilometers in my life, right? If I'm really adamant. But can I ever ride my bike to the moon? No. So time never makes the impossible possible, and I think sometimes we just don't think through that. We think more of our professors are in a position. So time is going to be one of those issues that we're talking about. It says, thus the heavens and the earth were finished and all the host of them, and on the seventh day God finished his work that he had done. We're not going to get into it, but there are other geochronometers, what they call geochronometers, that can actually tell us how old the Earth is. And many of them are very short, as in tens of thousands of years at the most, if we discount a global flood, to hundreds of thousands of years, to some millions. So the ones they only tell you about are the ones that they think will put. And it's interesting, because most people don't realize that the age of the Earth is based on a meteorite. And it's based in evolutionary theory, not necessarily in scientific evidence. Okay? But we have so many different things. So we're not getting into the age issue particularly today, but we will in two regards to two data points that we're going to be talking about with dinosaurs. Okay? We'll develop 5 points that helps us to understand dinosaurs in relationship to the Bible. So it's going to be contact points. Because of first and foremost, if we do believe the Bible is what it is, says it is, that this is a record that was handed down, and there have been statistical studies that have been done on Genesis. So the hermeneutic that we take as Lutherans would look at that and say, how was it understood by the people that first received it? It was understood as history. It was not understood as an analogy or as poetry, even though those are aspects within Scripture. It was not. And of course, that's my last animation. So had to do that, He looks really friendly. But 5 points that we're going to develop. And I think you'll see the reason for these. First is creation, clever design, and stasis. Second is fall and judgment, or catastrophic death. 3 is post-flood, or historical clashes with dragons. Next is scientific corroboration 1, radiocarbon footprint. And the last one is scientific corroboration, soft tissue remains. How many of you knew that we have soft tissue from, good amount of you. Good. Ironically, the first one was discovered almost 30 years ago. So, it's one of those things that's not as heard of. So creation, clever design, and stasis is what we'll talk about. And this will be the longer section, because you'll be looking at your watches going, oh my gosh, he's still on part 1. So it's the longer section, because there's some base work we're going to do. And this is a really simplified design argument. This is not usually the design argument I'm using if I'm in a debate, but every design had a designer. Biologic systems have highly complex design. Conclusion, therefore, the biologic systems had a designer. Okay? Very simple when we look at that. But when we look at DNA, the thing that we're going to have to deal with now, and I think it is actually the death knell of evolution, is the idea of information. When you look at your DNA, and now with epigenetics, it's even more complicated, because it looks like your DNA actually can be acted upon by something outside. So it's kind of like the blueprints, and the electrician can come in and say, no, we're going to reroute this. You can actually change your DNA. Interesting. And they're finding this not with the shots that you can get online, your own genetic engineering, but in the way you live your life. Okay? So you are a complex design. You truly are a spoken word, if you want to think about it. If we equate, this also shows that information is immaterial, because information can be done in different types of symbols, different languages. So it's not the material that carries it. It's immaterial that can be expressed in different ways. You truly are a word manifest. It's a very long word. And really, if you try to speak it, it's your DNA, all the different letters within the DNA. Organic life requires information-rich processing systems. It needs both hardware and software. Highest information density known to us is that of DNA. And now we're talking about, and I won't get into the details, what is called Shannon information. It's not necessarily, we're looking at how much we can pack with bits of information. So if we look at the DNA, 1 cubic, and this is where we're getting into it as well, it says, however, the concept of information has become just as fundamental and as far-reaching as matter and energy. They're saying now there are 3 fundamental units: matter, energy, and information. And materialism has a real bad problem with immaterial things. Can't seem to create them. Okay? And so we're looking at information. So, so the density of information in 1 cubic centimeter, okay, is that much in your DNA. That's how much it can store. So if we would take some of the higher chips today, and we would just try to calculate or put that amount of information, it would go 1.5 units. Basically, that's what it would take to put the same information on a physical type of medium. Pretty amazing. So it looks like within the human body, when it comes to at least the ability to contain information, there's no other molecule like the DNA molecule. But information's more than that. Information's more than that, because we have to understand what the information is. But Werner Gitt, he's kind of, think of MIT, but think of the German version. That's where he is out. He's a physicist and information scientist. But he said life is overwhelmingly loaded with information. Should be clear that a rigorous application of the science of information is devastating to materialistic philosophy in the guise of evolution, strongly supportive of a Genesis creation. There's even atheist philosophers, one from NYU, that basically said, he wrote a book called Mind and Cosmos, and the subtitle, Why the Neo-Darwinian View of the Universe is Most Certainly False. And he says, because it cannot attain and give us the things that we have to take: truth, consciousness, free will, all of these things, immaterial reality. Okay? So if you've heard, they used to tell us because we're done by evolution, we have junk DNA. Because if it's a process of mutation and failure and replication, all this, we're going to have a lot of junk stuff. Well, ENCODE has gone through 2 processes right now. ENCODE is basically, they're looking at the functionality, because they thought that only proteins were encoded. That the only functional part of DNA was encoding for proteins. They found pretty much, they believe 100% of it is functional. There is no such thing as junk DNA. Some of it is developmental in the sense of when genes turn on and off. And the way you can read DNA, thinking right off the top of my head, I know of at least 4 ways that DNA can be spliced and read, so a single text is not just linear. It is so complex, it's mind-numbing. But he said the junk DNA myth and simultaneously fulfilled an ID prediction, intelligent design. The non-coding parts of the genome would prove functional. Okay? One of the proponents admitted, he said, if ENCODE is right, then evolution is wrong. There's been additional ones. They followed up with them, saying now ENCODE 3 has just finished submitting its reports. Okay? And he says nothing like a little overkill to drive the point home, then evolution is wrong. So basically, what we're seeing is we dig into more DNA, we dig into the science of information. we're seeing a creator is necessary, an intelligent creator, because intelligence is the only known cause. Even if we used Darwin or cause and effect relationship in normal, the same way that Darwin came up with some of his ideas, can you think of any other cause that intelligence comes from? Any other thing that codes come from? People, identities, entities.
Is this author Christian?
He is.
What about ENCODE?
The guy who was head of ENCODE is a Christian. The problem is the one who worked on the ENCODE project is actually a theistic evolutionist. Stephen Meyer is actually an old earth creationist. So these are kind of engagements that we should have within the community, not separate us, depending on. But there is a right. There's a right and a wrong. But yes, he is a Christian. He is a philosopher of science. Okay? But it's interesting because SETI, have you seen the new SETI commercials? There's SETI commercials now. They're picking up search for extraterrestrial intelligence. And this guy, this scientist, wrote a paper because he said if we take the 4 specific criteria that Carl Sagan used for the SETI project, then no one would deny the intelligent design of human beings. So if we use their own logic, we show that they have to, but of course they don't like it. And so we move on, okay? Because each cell contains libraries of coded specifications like blueprints for building what the cell needs. This is like claiming the natural processes brought plastic, glass, and metal together. I sometimes think, when I talk to evolutionists, I say, I don't think you thought deep enough about the complexity of life. So when it is, and we think of when God made the beasts of the earth according to their kinds and the livestock according to their kinds, and God saw that it was good. And that's our beginning point. So we're going to look at some of the predictive qualities. So if the tree of life, now they've moved to a system called clades because now they're trying to use statistics, but they still need intermediary. They still need a tree of life. But we won't get into it, but some of the nomenclature, the way they talk about it, has changed somewhat so that they can try to get rid of the popular idea of a missing link because they can associate things. And we can talk about that later if anybody wants to. But if we look at the tree of life, there has to be a organic flow, if you want to call it, that produces everything that you see around us from the last universal common ancestor, what they call the LUCA. Okay? So when we look at that, evolutionary predictions, we would have a parent designed, and Dawkins is really big on this. We have to keep reminding ourselves that it's not designed. Sometimes you get hit so much, you know. But lowest life is going to have to be simple, constant change, because this is an increase in information. Okay? Lots of links. Now, if we look at the creation prediction, we're going to see more like an orchard. This right here, if you can see, it's kind of light blue is the flood. But what we're going to see is we're going to see that God built into diversification we see in the DNA for adaptation to environment. What a brilliant design. Now, there are barriers, and there's actually some studies on what are called orphan genes, that in each individual species, many creation scientists are looking into this area going, can we find out what the original kinds are? But these are genes that are specific to I want to say higher than a species, maybe closer to a family, that are not shared within different groups within the genome. So they're very specific. And it's a fascinating study that's going on. But you can see how you would get more of an orchard. So we have actual design, we have complexity everywhere, and we have stasis or no change. Okay? We're going to have distinctive kinds. So we're going to see which one is borne out by the evidence, because if we can see which one actually is more applicable to reality as we know it in true science, then again we can reverse engineer to go, you know, the assumptions seem to be holding true. And so it's a different way of not necessarily proving, but showing that it's more reasonable. Lowest life, simple, complex life everywhere, constant change, stasis not change, lots of links or distinctive kinds. Okay? So when we look at the lowest life, if we look at if this is truly a record of life evolving on Earth, then we should see that general. Now I think it's more ecological units that are getting absorbed by the flood, and that's why we have at the base so many aquatic. But we're going to see more about that later. But if we look at the trilobite, oh, they're fascinating. I don't know if you've ever looked at them up close, but their eyes. They have compound eyes. Compound eyes, I even went last night and started reading about it again. Wow. A lot of complex mathematics going on, refraction, all these things. This is not simple. Because for that animal to see those 1,000+ lenses have to relay information, have to have a focal point. It's actually much more, and even certain parts of evolutionary theory believe that our eye devolved from this eye. Yeah, I see devolution, I don't see evolution. But even what we see, like robber flies today, this was actually found on Kangaroo Island in Australia. It's the most complex eye we found. It has over 3,000 lenses. Now they think it was from a type of shrimp, but it was in the Cambrian era. That is the lowest one we have, and we'll talk about the Cambrian explosion. So you have some of the most sophisticated eyewear at the lowest level. And this is just emblematic. We're not going to get into a lot of different details. But their discovery reveals that some of the earliest animals possess very powerful vision. Similar eyes are found today still, well, not much change, in many living insects. Okay? We have what is called the Cambrian explosion, where basically most of, and this is another book by Steve Meyer, Darwin's Doubt. He's a fantastic author. But he basically looked at it. What happened is we have no evolution, and then boom, in the Cambrian explosion. Now they say within a span of 10 million years, and some extend it farther than that, we basically have now almost all the body plans of all the organisms that we'll learn. We have about 80% of them. But the problem is, there's nothing preceding it. So if evolutionary theory, we would see a lot of moving into these different body forms or phyla. Okay? Now, the thing is, it looks more like, you would say, the orchard than it does. All of these are gone. They had a couple of mollusks, a couple of things that they found in the Precambrian. But all of a sudden, in an instant in time, and this was one of Darwin's difficulties, is he dealt with, he said, all of this coming up at once, because if you can't show, and he even said this, if you cannot show that something came about by small incremental change, my theory totally falls apart. Okay? When we look at lowest life, and now many evolutionists will argue, yes, this is bacteria today, that's not the same as bacteria back then. I think that is something that they need sometimes to prove outside of their theory with evidence. This is what we call little bacteria. This is called the flagella motor. This thing goes at 100,000 RPMs, and it can stop in a quarter of a turn and go the other way. It's kind of like bacteria that are swimming through peanut butter. You got to have a pretty powerful motor. Okay, this is some of the simple life. This is single-celled organisms. This is where we get the idea of irreducible complexity, where there are certain things that are necessary or the organism dies. Okay? You think of a mousetrap. The standard mousetrap has 5 parts. You lose any one of them, you don't get a dead mouse. Okay? All of them have to be there simultaneously. And there's about 30 parts that make this. And if you're into boating or anything, you can see some familiar parts. But the one thing I want people to remember is this is on the microscopic level. And for these changes to take place, according to evolution, this is where I think you have to think deeper about it, is mutation has to happen here. And then it's got to be a positive thing that comes out here. Can you imagine that we're going to knock out this one, we're going to change this one, we're going to duplicate this, and oh my gosh, we got a motor. Doesn't happen like that. There's a great book out there written by a molecular biologist called Undeniable. And he goes through some of that. But you start seeing the complexity in the simplest of life. And so the lowest life is not simple. We're seeing complex life at the very bottom when we start seeing fossilization. We see the most complex eyes. We see organisms that are need all the different systems to go, and there's nothing prior to it. How about constant change? Coelacanth, a lot of the times they have what are called index fossils. Index fossils were to tell them what age the layer was according to evolutionary theory. We won't get into that, but you can ask me later. But we found these coelacanths swimming at the bottom of the Indian Ocean in the 30s. So they were supposedly extinct for 70 million years. So if somebody found a coelacanth, they automatically put it to the Cretaceous or beyond. Kind of screws it up. Really, it wasn't extinct, it's just That was the last appearance we seem to have in the fossil record, and we need to remember that these are not, just because something's not there, they have a big problem with a lot of the sauropods. Giant sauropods were denizens of the Jurassic, then they disappear for tens to, over 100 million years before they show up again in the Cretaceous. Did they re-evolve back? So we need to make sure that we're understanding the fossil record correctly, that this is just dead animals that have been buried in deposits. And so the real question comes, how are they laid down? I'm not doing that talk this year, but it's fascinating when you look at geology. It is so easy to see the global flood. But we have animals. So we have the coelacanths, supposedly dead for 70 million years. There's a book called Living Fossils that is fascinating. He went through all of the museums, or a lot of the major museums in the world, and he started comparing modern to dinosaur era, finding out that really, phylogenetically, or their expression, or at least the parts that we can match, they were exactly similar. And we see this all over. Okay, we won't get into a lot of them, but he goes through on top saying this organism is the same when we find it in the fossil record 400 million years ago as we have it today. Nothing has changed within that. So we have constant change. Now, there are variations, again, within kind that we see, and we'll get more into that when we get into the specific design in dinosaurs. Now, I do this, not as, I love these pictures, but you would have what we would call chimeric kind of animals that would be through the fossil record, because they would be gaining. Think of it, how are you going to get from a dinosaur to a bird without some interesting combinations? We will get into that later. But we do not see any of these links that are going through. And I've heard people say, well, everything is a link. To me, that's a cop-out, because it's not really showing the progression. When we look at the distinctive kinds, an important conference was convened in Chicago in 1980 about whether the mechanisms of change in microevolution could be extrapolated to macroevolution. What they do is they do what is called equivocation. They'll change the meaning of the word. A lot of the times they will not. When I get into engagements, they don't like the differentiation between micro and macroevolution. Microevolution is what we would call change within kind. The beak's getting smaller or bigger on certain birds, depending on things, okay? Macroevolution is when you can turn a cat into a dog or another animal, okay? It's interesting because in the scientific community, you should never use analogy to prove your point. You should use evidence. But when it comes to macroevolution, the only thing they have is analogy. They have no scientific evidence, okay? So he poured, at the risk of doing violence to the positions of some of the people at the meeting, the answer can be given as a clear no, okay? So when we think about this, this is what they call a phylogenetic tree. The black is where we actually have fossil remains. The white are inferred. No evidence found, okay? You can see it kind of in a different way, is that we have an expansion. We have maybe things within a kind that are expanding, but there's no over or cross, if you want to call it pollinating, to dinosaurs or carrying over to other ways. Now it's interesting, we're going to find out a lot of research has been done on bone graveyards where only one type of dinosaur. There's a burial place in Canada that has 10,000 ceratopsians buried. And so they're doing some comparison things of that nature that think that most of this, just like with dogs, is variation, could be with age, could be with breeding, that really they probably could have fertile offspring, all of them. So when we look at it again, there are no links. And Weishampel, who we're going to get to a quote from him in just a second, he's at Johns Hopkins, and if you love dinosaurs, he was the primary editor of a book called Dinosauria. It is huge. It'll put you to sleep most of the time, but it's basically updated with all the finds about the dinosaurs, the anatomy, that. And he said, from my reading of the fossil record of dinosaurs, no direct ancestors have been discovered for any dinosaur species. Alas, my list of dinosaurian ancestors is an empty one. Okay? So you're expected, and we're told, as a matter of fact, I was just reading an article this morning, that we know, of course, dinosaurs turned into birds. Okay? We know, of course, that dinosaurs evolved from something else, but we have no actual evidence to show any of that. So do we have lots of links? It seems that we have distinctive kinds. And it's interesting, prominent evolutionist evaluations, interesting, Stephen Jay Gould, he was also influenced by his Marxism, but he came up with a theory called punctuated equilibrium. And he came up with a theory because there was no evidence in his field that showed what he wanted to find. And so a lot of people heard it as the hopeful monster theory. He ended up in the end saying even if it's punctuated equilibrium, which is short bursts of evolution, just expands in the areas that aren't recorded. Seems a little like special pleading. But what he says, the history of most fossil species includes two features particularly inconsistent with gradualism. Stasis. Most species exhibit no directional change during their tenure on Earth. They appear in the fossil record looking much the same as when they disappear. Morphological change is usually limited and directionless, and the sudden appearance. In any local area, a species does not arise gradually by the steady transformation of its ancestors. It appears all at once and fully formed. Okay? This was his analysis. Niles Eldredge, who was one of the guys that helped work on the punctuated equilibrium, he said 120 years of paleontological research later, it's become abundantly clear the fossil record will not confirm this part of Darwin's prediction. Nor is the problem a miserably poor record. The fossil record simply shows that his prediction is wrong. The observation that species are amazingly conservative and static entities not changing throughout long periods of time has all the qualities of the emperor's new clothes. Everyone knew it but preferred to ignore it. Paleontologists, faced with a recalcitrant record, obstinately refusing to yield Darwin's predicted pattern, simply look the other way. Okay? And again, he's in that field, and things have not changed. Okay? So let's look at some of, this is Diplodocus, and some of the design is amazing. You know, in the new heaven and the new earth. I'm sure we're going to have these guys back. And I always tell my kids to, you know, kind of ride a triceratops. It's kind of like that. Be kind of cool. Okay? We also have to remember that even if we look at if we look at the fossil record, we seem to have up to 7 times the amount of vegetation in the pre-flood world. And so we look at some signatures, and we won't get into it, that the level of carbon dioxide and the level of oxygen was much higher. Some people even put it close to 30%. Well, if we didn't have, you know, spontaneous lightning and stuff, you know, when you get higher oxygen levels, it can become a problem. But we've also known that gigantism comes from increased oxygen. So when we look at the dinosaurs, and if they are, and there's the debate whether they're warm or cold-blooded, but if they, like reptiles today, continue to grow throughout their lives, and you have you got some pretty big animals. Now they are very distinctive from the lizards we have today and reptiles we have today. But Diplodocus, so when we look at some of the things in regards to the design, this is a great book. Dinosaurs, Marvels of God's Creation. He's a paleontologist and a geologist, but it's great. But this comes from a secular report. So some secular paleontologists concluded sauropods possessed a set of 7 unique characteristics. Now think about it. A mousetrap has 5. We're thinking 7, so this is more complex than a mousetrap, obviously. But again, think deeply that these things have to be in place. It's similar to, I have a VW, 66 VW Bug. It's the simplest of engines, and it still makes my head spin sometimes. You guys, these things all have to be in place for it to work. And one of the guys that I love, his name is John Sanford. He taught at Cornell. He was an evolutionist, became an old Earth creationist, became a young Earth creationist, and it was all because of genetics. He has like 57 patents to his name. But he basically said evolution wants you to believe that, he said, we started with a manual, and if we take words out here, a missed page, and that, all of a sudden things become more complex. He said, we all know that that's not the case. And so when we think about even 7 unique characteristics, how impossibly difficult this would be for evolution to acquire them by chance and accident. And remember, evolution has no mind. It doesn't have an end goal that it's going to. There's even atheist philosophers, Jonathan Gray, out of London School of Economics, and he said, atheists, if what you believe is true about evolution, stop flying on the coattails of Christianity. There is no such thing as progress. It's a conception that we've created because there is no where are we going? What are we doing? Okay? And so evolution has no mind that is directing it. So they had sufficient body size to support a long neck. They had skeletal stability through the quadrupedal stance. Okay, and the locking mechanisms actually in a lot of the larger ones. Small heads easily supported by the neck, had 10 or more neck vertebrae, elongated vertebrae, and they may, this is questionable, they have, if they had kind of air sac breathing system like a bird. This has been thrown in a lot of the times because if you know the difference between a bellow style lung and a bird lung, they are very, very different. And to get one from the other would most definitely cause the death in the transition. So they're trying to look in there, but they had pneumaticity. Their bones, can you imagine if you've seen some of the bones of some of these sauropods, if they were not full of holes? And I mean, the way they're structured is amazing. They are structured for size and lightweight. Man, I mean, it is amazing. So similar again to a mousetrap. How do those things come together? Okay, we look at just similar structures. We look at, what was that?
I hope it wasn't me.
No, yeah. Did you guys hear that?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm like, okay, well, this could get dangerous. So with like bridges and that, we can see the structure. Okay, one of my favorite. What was that?
It was Darwin's bubble.
I mustn't. We have Brachiosaurus is one of my favorite because the first one was found in Grand Junction, Colorado, on Riggs Hill. Elmer Riggs was working for the Chicago Field Museum. But it is fascinating. So when we look at the Brachiosaurus, some amazing things, because obviously it is the only one that its head goes up, and we of course think of Jurassic Park and the sneezing part. But when we look at it, when we think about the structure, and these are some of the original things that Riggs had done, you have the front vertebrae on this neck almost working like leaf springs on some larger vehicles. You actually also have through the neck all the way up to the head. You'd think, one tendon, if you've ever had a long crane, if you only have one thing, you're going to have a very wobbly crane. There's actually 2 ligaments that go up through the entire neck. And so you see design features that we see in modern equipment that are in the dinosaurs. They were engineered for size. It talks about how some of their bones interlocked. You guys, all of that has to happen by chance and accident, starting from simpler organisms that have increased in information. There's a book written by a guy by the name of Michael Behe. It's called The Edge of Evolution. And what he tried to see is, are there any truly beneficial mutations? Because you always hear about, resistant bacteria and other things. He said, are there truly anything? And he said, everyone moves to the devolution of the animal. It may have an instance of a particular ability. So you can't get sickle cell anemia, or not sickle cell, you can't get malaria. But sickle cell anemia will kill you, by a certain age. So these maladaptions are not an increase of information, but a decrease. Okay? Then we look at some of the duck build. And this will come a little later in the talk, but I want to make sure that bone bed about 70 miles northwest of Great Falls, Montana, stretches 1¼ mile to quarter mile north to south, approximately 3 feet thick. Okay? Estimated 10,000 myosaurs. They're called myosaurs. They're a type of duck-billed dinosaur. Buried, smashed. Can you imagine the force that would put that many animals that can range up to 7 tons smashed in that little itty space? The force of the flood you can see in many of these things. But the reason I brought it up, because we have eggs, first discovered in a Mongolian expedition, but Montana, we have found a ton. These are kind of different distributions of eggs that have been found. And I did some research again last night on the complexity of eggs. And one biologist, and he was equating all eggs, whether it's, like human egg to eggs that mature outside the body, that one cell has everything, the material it needs, plus the computer program, the developmental cues to bring about something entirely new. The complexity is unimaginable. So eggs, when we think about it at the time, so some of the largest eggs are about the size of a football. But some fascinating things we've found is they put them in an MRI, and we've been able to see and look at some of the development of some of these animals. And recently, we have also found they have unfossilized embryonic material. So we're finding this unfossilized material throughout the spectrum of the fossil record. Okay? And then we look at one of my favorites. I love the ceratopsians, but the triceratops. Okay? And there's a study we'll get to later. And again, they have these monolithic bone beds that are just huge, that are just one dinosaur, one type of dinosaur. And this is where some of the ideas of herding come from. But, they're disarticulated, means kind of they were torn apart, many of them. So it's not like, something came over them and they just kind of died peacefully there. But when we look at some of the design features in a triceratops has some of, and we're just going to look at the neck region, or the head region, they have some of the most complicated teeth. They have 5 layers of different minerals in their teeth. So it's almost like they could sharpen and shear. Those teeth could chew through almost anything. And when we look at the structure, because you would have, tendons and other things attached to the frill. You basically, with those teeth and with that kind of chomping power, the fulcrum, it could eat through anything. And we have found things like pieces of logs that triceratops have decided to eat. We also think that these were thermal regulators, so they were biofeedback loops to keep the animal. Wow. Well, no, this is wet. I don't know what happened. Something exploded. Oh.
Look at their battery.
Yeah, I think that's what happened.
You need to wash your hands, dude.
Yeah. I need...
acid in the beginning of the...
Yeah! Now, this is going to cause a problem. Because if I don't have this...
So it's Dawkins are in.
Yeah, let me go wash my hands really quick. Give me 2 seconds. I'll be right back. I was like, my hands are wet. That would be great. Yeah.
Good stuff.
Oh, good. Thank you. Sorry, we had the interruption. All right. So if I start twitching or something,
We'll watch.
Yeah. I was wondering that was...
Get you to sit back there.
What I may do is just kind of move things around really quick so that I can access it. Oh, yeah, that's fine. That should be fine. Whoops, I'm throwing things at you now. There we go. And yeah, you may have to wipe out. I think a battery exploded in there, in mine. So you may want to wipe it out before you put in another battery. I'm so sorry. Okay, so we'll move on now. All right. And so we can see that in the beginning, if we look at design, we can see both from philosophical ideas when it comes to information theory to the design that we have within them and how we come about that design. We can truly affirm, that in the beginning it was very good. Okay? And so I love this. There's actually one of the books that Werner Gitt wrote is called Without Excuse. It's hard to get through. It's on information theory, and it can make heads spin. But I do think that it is really a killer for evolution, because they have to account for specific information, both systems that give the information, systems that understand the information, and then systems that can construct what the information is given them to do. So, huh?
That book is called
Oh, Without Excuse. Yes. Okay. Awesome. Cool. We'll see. Hey, your miracle worker. Thank you. Now, if something else explodes, we're going to do a non-tech kind of talk and get the information to you. Okay, so that took a long time, I know. So fall and judgment, so catastrophic death. If there was a worldwide flood, we think that we would see that in the fossil record, especially when it comes to dinosaurs. Okay, so fall, judgment, catastrophic death. And so first thing, the Lord saw wickedness of man was great in the earth. So the Lord said, I will blot out man whom I have created from the face and the land and the animals. But Noah found grace. Okay, first thing we're going to talk about is death poses. Have most of you seen these kind of death poses where their necks are kind of thrown back, usually for the neck dinosaurs? And there's a great debate about what has caused this. The consensus primarily is holding, and we'll get to that, is that it is death throes. That actually this is actual effect as well, physiologically, from asphyxiation. So they've done studies on this. They put dead chickens in water. You know, should put some live chickens in water if they want to check, but probably wouldn't get past PETA with that, even though we eat them. So what basically this, and I know the words can't see, it's not normal. This is not something that seems to be, but it is predominant through the fossil record. And we have some fascinating, one of them is that the water pushes them, so their necks are kind of gently pushed back, and the only problem is sometimes their legs are like this and doesn't seem to affect. Most of the time what they see, there's ideas of poisoning, but most people hold that it is due to asphyxiation and trying to breathe, doing all that they can to survive as they're being buried. Okay? So when we think about it, there's other death poses. This is an ichthyosaur giving live birth. Okay? So, interesting. Oh, the fossil record is fascinating. We have somebody that was just about to enjoy lunch. We have turtles that were trying to make other turtles. And then we have these mass graveyards. And we have a lot of burials that are not where they're supposed to be. This is one of my favorites. It's called the Fighting Dinosaurs. And it's actually, they were buried, the Triceratops has the theropod's foot in its mouth. Yeah, so obviously they got buried very quickly. Don't think they held the pose for that long, but some fascinating things. We also find land dinosaurs that have fossils of marine life with them. So it's not their normal habitat. We also see no decomposition. We don't see any of the problems that naturally comes. I used to show a video to my students. It was a time-lapse one. A whale falling to the bottom, a blue whale falling to the bottom of the ocean. Within 3 months, that thing was gone. I mean, the entire thing, not a trace left. Okay. But we see these death poses, and this is fascinating. We have, you guys all know, R. robustus and Psittacosaurus. Okay?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Right here. Basically, we have the dinosaur in the belly of a mammal. Okay, this is kind of an artistic rendition of it. And so we have a lot of animals that are supposed to be not associated, or at least the sizes and differences. Okay, so well-preserved fossil dinosaur skin from a plant-eating Psittacosaurus was studied and found to contain 40 separate layers. You guys, the skin structure, okay? Each layer was designed with collagenous fibers arranged in opposite directions, cross-layering, layer to layer, giving strength to the skin, similar to the cross-grained strength ability of plywood. None of these creatures were simple. None of it, I mean, the complexities. We just have, unfortunately, extinct animals like the dodo that, due to causes, we just no longer have anymore. So when we think about this, and this is some of the information that was on it as they looked at it, but we also have birds in the belly of dinosaurs. We have all sorts of interesting examples within the fossil record. So the fossil record actually is a record of catastrophic death. On scales, think about the 10,000 Mauser that are squished into a little bitty, living space. They are just compounded. We have these all over. In Alberta, Canada, there's 50 such graveyards. It is just amazing the amount of inundation that is taking place. Okay, this is one of my favorites. This is Sue. Sue is at the Chicago Museum. This is actually Sue's original nose. Okay, obviously they have other ones, so they reconstructed it, make it look a little bigger. When they found Sue, she was completely bent in half. Her head was smashed, not just the normal death pose, it was actually embedded in her rump. Can you imagine taking a T-Rex, and this is one of the largest T-Rexes we have, can you imagine doing that to an animal, what kind of force that would take? So when we look at that and we see these death poses, we see catastrophe. When we look at also trace fossils, what are called trace fossils, this is fascinating because we find these especially around Denver, Colorado. Actually, they go up what they call the trackway. We have millions of these. We have one trackway that goes for 45 miles that we find, and they all seem to be going in the same direction, and they all seem predator and prey alike. It seems like they're moving, because usually animals do not go in straight directions. Okay, these are locations of fossil footprints. This is called the dinosaur highway in through here. Okay. We also, did you guys know that we have fossil bones all over the world? Even in the Arctic and the Antarctic. Okay, things were a lot different in the past. And this is another reason why they want to say that dinosaurs were warm-blooded. Because if, even in the evolutionary framework of the continents moving, they still would have been in regions that would have been uninhabitable by dinosaurs. Okay? Again, egg sites we have just all over the world, but one thing that's really fascinating, and this came from a study that was done out of China, that the dinosaurs had to swim out of necessity. There were a couple of reports in that they're finding dinosaur footprints, okay, different types of dinosaur tracks, and it gives you kind of the idea of who they were, determined that at least one of the theropods was partly afloat. As much as 50 feet trackway shows tip scratches. Okay? Second one walking in the same direction on the same horizon, apparently waiting on the bottom. Footprints were more complete. Okay? Then they said it was a flood event. Both, in the case, were estimated to have hip heights just less than 3 feet. Concluded the pair were simultaneously swimming and waiting as rapid fluctuations in water were occurring. Okay? So what you basically had is they were trying to get away from the rising floodwaters. And so you have different indications, and we see this in many different places. Okay? And so they needed to swim, some were walking, depending on their size. Okay? And so again, this is up at Dinosaur Ridge, but they've also found out that the prey to predator ratio is not what it should be, according to what we found. So it seems like the more mobile predators were more abundant than a lot of the prey that were seemingly not as quick. Okay, so there's still some theories. Again, we're working with different things and we're trying to look at the evidence. Okay, so we'll skip through that really quick. But also it's kind of interesting because if we look at some of the work that's been done, most of the dinosaur bones that we find are what, when geologists look at the different layers, believe was probably the highest portion left, at least on the North American continent. And this is also why, in escaping we see whole, like, in Montana, we see one type, like the Mauser, because we also find not many babies in that one. It seems like it's primarily later juvenile and adult. Maybe the younger ones could not escape, could not keep up, whatever may be the case. Waters prevailed so mightily on the earth that the high mountains under the whole heaven were covered, and they prevailed 15 cubits deep, and all flesh died. So we can see that this is what we would expect from a biblical account. So prominent evolutionist evaluations, anyone who cherishes notions that evolution is always slow and continuous will be shaken out of his beliefs by breakfast bench and the other geologic markers of cataclysm. There was a guy in this area that built his entire cabin out of fossils, out of dinosaur bones. They were so abundant. Piled in like logs in a jam, there's no ordinary spring flood from one of the streams in the area, catastrophic inundation. Okay? Now, when it comes to Noah's Ark, a lot of people will ask, how could you fit? And we'll go quickly through this. There's great resources on this. If we look at the number of species, even from a secular level, most of them were not needing to be on the Ark when we think of most of what would be categorized as species. And it was interesting, and these are just some of the numbers when we're looking at total estimated, and this is from a creation organization that did that estimation. But when we look at it, there was a group that were looking at buoyancy laws, and they wanted to see, they really wanted to make fun that if we took the Ark's dimension, it could not float. It would not be able to sustain. And they found out that it could have floated with 70,000 animals. Okay? And so, and there's been some great work that has been done on the Ark. And I think we have such a simplistic view of the Ark. When we look at, there's some studies that have been done that look at ancient shipbuilding. So the way past in the Greeks and the Phoenicians and some of those, and have said, what were some of the model designs that they had at this time? Because if Noah built the Ark and it survived the flood, they may say, hey, you know what? He lasted a year. Maybe there's some features on that boat, because we're not given direct, we're given, size dimension, but we're not given everything we need. We have things like moon pools. Moon pools were part of in boats, in some of the ancient boats, where it was cut out. Well, this would cause, an up and down motion. You could run water systems off of it, and at that time, there's so much complexity that Noah's Ark, with the technology they had at the time, could easily have sustained. And then we have different characteristics with animals when they're in fear. The dinosaurs would have been on there with them. Okay, and of course you would have taken smaller ones, not full grown, and we can look at growth patterns with bones and stuff from fossil dinosaurs and how we think they grew. Similar to reptiles nowadays, there's a certain time where they're fairly static or small, don't grow much, and then all of a sudden, boom, over a certain period of time when they get to maturity. So there would have been some, and remember, God said he would bring the animals to the Ark, so I'm sure he got some good ones. Okay, but there are some great feasibility studies. If you are into some heavy science, he even talks about how you could use fecal matter in using to burn things. And people have done some real in-depth studies on the feasibility of the Ark, and we won't get into it too much today. Now, if we break it down, most creation scientists, especially that are working in the area of paleontology, think there's between 50 kinds or 60 families, is what is now thought. So if you look at the dinosaurs, so if you look at all the ceratopsians, are they just levels of development? Are they different sexes? Are they just genetic differences that can come about, similar to other animals? Similar to the duckbills and some of the great sauropods. Okay? We can see that they would have been on the Ark, and very similar to dogs nowadays. If you look back into the 1600s, most of the dogs we have today did not exist, obviously. Okay? They were from selective breeding. And so when we look at these, and it's really hard to tell whether they're the same species because we can't get two triceratops to mate. It's kind of difficult right now. So we need to do that to be able to do that. I know. Well, actually, we have found dinosaur DNA. But, yeah, you have nothing to put it into, though. I know. But you see some of the variations, and obviously the colorations are variations that, the artist, we do have some skin from dinosaurs that we can tell the level of melanin, we can get some idea of what color they may have been. So it's very fascinating. Okay, that's one I'm going to ride. Okay, so when we look at the Ark, they would have been on board the Ark. They would have been put in, somewhere that as Noah designed a lot of those details we were not given. But also, this has troubled many atheists, is the universality of flood legends. throughout the world. And there's some great studies that have been done on that as well. But Noah's Ark, most definitely, if it was not on the ark, it died. Okay, third one is we look at post-flood historical clashes. So if we look at just a gradual through history, through the Bible from beginning to end, we're going to start seeing that each of these have touch points, again, that help us to understand the reasonableness of, in a scientific endeavor, if you want to call it, or in a historical context, that we can show people that our ideas are very reasonable. Okay? So, historical clashes with dragons. So, dinosaurs of old. Okay? Again, the word dinosaur didn't come into use until 1841. Richard Owen brought it in when they were first starting to discover these things in England. Anybody know who that is? Schmaug. Anybody know who that is?
Dinosaur Man.
Yeah, I mean, that is actually this. It's in the Indiana Children's Museum, and they named it Dracoryx hogwartsia. Is the name of the, but it is a type of what we think is a Pachyosaurus, the ones that would put their heads down, and or we assume they have kind of the big crowns on their head, and these are immature. The horns may have been lost, but we see things that even are very symbolic of the way we picture dinosaurs. But we have things like Beowulf. Different, if you're familiar, Epic of Gilgamesh, we have different animals that were what we would consider dragons, dinosaurs. Could they be mythological? Yes. But we see in a lot of cases that these are in context with other things that we know of the world. So we have St. George and the Dragon. The first one actually that it's based off of comes from the area of Cappadocia. But we even have Alexander the Great speaking of what we would consider dinosaurs. We have Marco Polo in the 1300s that went to China and talks about it. We actually have Josephus referencing. We have other Greek and Roman historians that speak of these animals. This is interesting because a French anatomist, Historia Animalium, in the 1500s, he comprised a book of animals, both known and ones that had passed. And so these were taken from prior records as well as observation. And these are some of the things that he put in there with tiger. It's interesting as well as he put in an armadillo when he saw it in Turkey. Turkey no longer has any armadillos. They're only found in North and South America. So even within the lifetime of this book, things have gone extinct. Okay? This was another gentleman that was also recording the same thing. These were just listed. There was nothing outside saying, we've heard about these magic animals and all this. They said, no, here's another animal from the region on the east side of the Mediterranean when we look at Syria and we look at places like that. And there's a reference, you know, when we think about the Bible, when we think about the fiery serpents and that, you know, there's some debate on that as well. So, we seem to have at least ideas, okay, and we want a cumulative case. This is from Cambodia, and all these are other animals, but here we have a symbol of what looks very much like a stegosaurus. And again, these are not like, aha, that's it. This is a cumulative case argument. We're looking at all the different possibilities. Is it reasonable to believe that man at one time in his past saw these as living? Because remember, people were not digging up dinosaur bones to reconstruct dinosaurs until the 19th and 20th century. Okay, and if they are extinct for 65 million years, there's no cohabitation. Okay, so we see that, and we see other places as well. I mean, it looks like a stegosaurus. Okay, we have cylinder seals from about 3000 BC, Sumerian, that have animals that look very much like ones that we've uncovered. Now these, do not go and Google Ica stones. Okay? You can, but be careful. Most of them are pornographic. They were burial stones. Now the problem is, and this article, they know these are in the Nazca area, but they were buried in graves. These are from about 1000 AD. Now, they are making, which is really horrible, they're making fakes now. So this you have to be careful with, but these are, and there's some archaeologists that have worked in the area when they were first discovered, but these are from 800 years before these were starting to be discovered again. Okay? We have very good renditions. Maybe they're just really imaginative and dang, they just hit it right on the spot. Is it a possibility? Yeah, it's a possibility. I mean, but is it reasonable? We also have other historical accounts. The grave of Bishop Bell. Okay, and this was on the floor. You can't see it anymore. It's covered by a rug. I think they'll move it if you ask them to. But around the bronze engraving, he has all these different animals. His favorite hunting dog, the things that he hunted, all different types of animals. But he also has this guy, or these two guys. Girls can't tell. Okay, the one with the hooks on its tail, or the horns on its tail, looks like a Dinosaurs, which we've just recently discovered. The other one looks like a normal sauropod. But again, this is on the side of his burial. Every other animal is known. Did he just think, you know what, I'm going to put in an imaginative one? We've got to think about these things. Is it possible? Again, yes, and that's the Dinosaurs. Okay. We look at other places. We look in France. We look at a lot of, this was from the 1500s, and it's a large tapestry. Every time I say tapestry, I think of Indiana Jones. But anyways, the large tapestry, and it shows animals that are well known. And again, they have other animals and their babies that look a lot like what we would think of with duck-billed dinosaurs. So we seem to have these images that are popping up in so many different cultures. We see it in the Southwest especially. I know that's hard to see right now. There we go. This one is just in Wapaki. So if you go over to the Middle Mesa in Wapaki National Monument over by Flagstaff, you can actually, it's called Puff the Magic Dragon. Again, it's viewed as being a couple hundred years old. It's somewhat difficult to date some of those. But we seem to have, even in Native American art, we have it even going back when we think of the Chinese zodiac. The dragon is, again, a part of that with other common animals. Now, it's interesting, there is a group called the Hagshun, culture, and they died out, or this specific culture, about 3,000 years ago, 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. And they did a lot of work with jade and other semi-precious stones, and they would make fetishes, what we would call fetishes, but they had some fascinating fetishes as well. So we start looking, and again, these are artistic representations. So yes, the similar pose. So I'm not trying to pull one over, but you can see the similarities. Okay? This is the Pachyosaurus we had talked about. Just some fascinating similarities. Okay? Those are just certain things we have to take into account. We have to look at them and we have to see, where did these images come from? Why did they do it certain ways? And I think it's because they actually knew the animals. We have it from all over the world. We have Greek, we have down in Mexico, we have all over, we have these animals that are represented in what we would call dinosaurs. Okay? We have, like, behold, Behemoth, which is made, eats grass like an ox, tail stiff like a cedar, his bones are tubes of bronze, his limbs like irons of bronze. Now, it's fascinating because we're actually told that grass at the time of the dinosaurs was not actually a food source, except we can do studies now and we can see, and we can actually go into the dino poop, and we can look in the dino poop, and we can see what they ate. And they ate grass. Okay? So when we see also references, tail like a cedar, and the cedar in Lebanon were huge trees. We maybe think more of our sequoias. They were huge. They're something like a Seismosaurus. Okay? And yes, they were vegetarian before the fall. Yes. Can you draw out Leviathan with a fishhook or press down his tongue with a cord? Leviathan. And somebody who knows this, I'm taking on, I don't speak Hebrew. So many of you pastors may, so you can check me. I looked it up, but from two Hebrew words that mean wreathed and dragon. Okay? And that's one thing that I was trusting somebody else for, because I don't know Hebrew. But when we look at that, and out of his mouth go flaming torches, sparks of fire leap forth, out of his nostrils come forth smoke. We have insects that have capabilities of mixing chemicals and causing explosions that they use. These are bugs. There's actually, other people believe that one of the duck-billed dinosaurs, there's chambers within. Could it have held chemicals to be able to do something, or was it a sounding chamber? I don't know, but we seem to have these kind of ideas. Okay? When we think about extinction, these are some of my favorite. There's like over 100 theories for their extinction. Brains too small, couldn't compete with the mammals, other animals ate their eggs, disease or glandular disorders, chronic constipation because the food source was changing, cosmic rays from a supernova, changes in the magnetic field, meteor impact like Chicxulub that they say down in the Yucatan Peninsula, drastic change in climate. I think the last two are probably the most appropriate because if they are, depending on, you had a very denuded Earth at the end of the flood. And the Flintstones had it right. You get a brontosaurus and man, feeding the family for a while. Okay, but one of my favorites, development of psychotic suicide factors. One of the theories. Yes. Oh, some of the things you read in science just crack you up. I remember somebody saying it was done, actually, NASA had been part of it, but our use of chlorofluorocarbons, that an alien species was going to see that we were using it, so we shouldn't use hairspray because they may invade. No joke. Funded. You funded that. So.
Wow.
I know. Scientific corroboration, radiocarbon footprint. Okay, so when we call radiocarbon dating, okay, and we'll get into this. We can ask questions later if you have some about radiometric dating in general. I'm just going to take you briefly through. But you have cosmic rays that hit nitrogen-14, turn it into carbon-14, gets absorbed as, plants are doing their thing, then we as the horses and everything else, then the animal dies. Once the animal dies, the amount of carbon-14, it's a radioactive, it decays. And so we can tell what its half-life is. We can tell how long before half of the remaining amount goes back to the nitrogen-14. And so this is a plausible way of dating. Okay? So when we look at that, it's kind of like an egg timer. So if we have our deer Triceratops, he passes away. And so basically every 5,700 years, approximately, we lose half of the amount of carbon-14. Okay? So basically we can look, and it's really with the methods that we have today, it's really limited to about 100,000 years. And you even ask evolutionists, they'll say the age of the specimen is not in question. And even if it were, carbon dating is so absurdly inappropriate and useless that only an ignorant clown, okay, would ask to do it. It doesn't matter what number would come out. It would be spurious, irrelevant, uninterpretable, because carbon-14 has an upper bound of 50,000 years. Okay, the problem is that there was a project done called the RATE project. It was about an $8 million project that people primarily at ICR, the Institute for Creation Research, looked. You can get all their information, but they found undecayed carbon-14 throughout. My sister used to work in a coal lab, or in a coal mine. Coal has large amounts of carbon-14 in areas that they're looking when they look at the analysis. So really, carbon-14, if this is really a determinant of age, then carbon-14 should not be found below that line. But yet when they did studies, they found that carbon-14 was found throughout the entire geologic record. And so it's interesting, our dinosaur, there's what's called the iDino project we'll get to in a second. Even carbon-14 they have found in diamonds. So this is the hardest carbon substance. So you look at things, they talk about leakage or other things, there should be no carbon in diamonds. Okay? So when we look at this, the iDino project also did additional studies on radiocarbon. Okay? And what they found, primarily what they did, it was from a dug up Triceratops horn that they looked at. And so basically, 7 dinosaur bones from Montana, Canada, Oklahoma, 5 different laboratory, carbon-14 in all the samples. So everything they sent. Okay? There are lists. You guys, we have carbon-14 going into the Cambrian, which is 500 million years ago. Okay? it is an impossibility, or you have to say that the whole method is faulted. Okay, so you have problems. If they want to say that it's contaminated, then you have issues with carbon dating in general. And I think it's extremely powerful evidence. Okay, because it should not be there according to science. What we know about when they die, when it starts going, and now there's a lot of assumptions with what the carbon-14 in the air was, and we can get into that later, but there's some problems there. The second, so now we're looking at what most people today would think of as scientific evidence for the not too long ago dinosaurs. Okay, so scientific proof, soft tissue remains. So when we look at soft tissue, the first one, Schweitzer, was in the mid-90s, and it was this T-Rex bone. And what happened is in transportation, they had kind of broke it. They ended up putting it in a solution too long, and all of a sudden, they started seeing things. She actually said she ran her test, I think the initial test, 17 times, because she knew what this would do, that it was not possible. So a thin slice of T-Rex bone glowed amber beneath the lens of my microscope. Blood vessel channels snake through a bone matrix, tiny chambers known as lacunae, which house bone-forming cells appeared as small ovals. Then a colleague took one look and then shouted, "You've got red blood cells. You've got red blood cells." It was exactly like looking at a slice of modern bone. But of course, I couldn't believe it. I said to the lab technician, the bones, after all, are 65 million years old. How could the blood cells survive that long? Okay, so these were fresh. So these are some of the pictures of some of them. Now, actually, ICR for quite a while was compiling whenever they had a find. They stopped compiling it. I mean, it's in multiple different types of dinosaurs. It's in non-dinosaurs. We have stuff all over the place. It is really fascinating. Flexible and resilient when stretched, returned to its original shape. Okay, these are just some of them. So we have scorpions, squids, mosasaurs, T-Rex, okay? And the list is huge. This was the beginning of the publication, and they were marking where they were in secular journals. You can still get that online, okay? We have all the way back to 630 million years, okay? From a physics standpoint, just the breakdown, the internal with radiation that's inherent, and and it's interesting, she was asked, I don't know if I put that quote in here. Yes, I did. I had one reviewer tell me that he didn't care what the data said. He knew that I was finding wasn't possible. I wrote back and said, well, what data would convince you? And he said, none. Well, this is where you are stuck in a paradigm where you can't see. And actually, Kuhn, who was a philosopher of science, basically said that when it comes to scientific revolutions, it takes things like this. Because can you imagine telling somebody who has spent their entire life studying something that everything they've done is false? I mean, these are brilliant people. I'm not malign. I mean, they're doing, but they have a framework that they're interpreting through, and they don't allow certain things in. And so when it comes to contrary evidence, what happens is it can't be. It's got to be some anomaly. Well, when you have dinosaur after dinosaur and other things coming in, it's not an anomaly. It's happening. It's different areas, different regions. Okay? These are the different materials that have been found. Okay? Now, the longest lasting is the collagen. And if we give them the benefit of the doubt, and again, this is the article I was saying that we do have some possible DNA. That was in Scientific American. Genetic material is not supposed to last over such time periods, not by a long shot. DNA begins to decay at death. Findings from a 2012 study on moa bones show an organism's genetic material deteriorates. Half-life is 521 years. Okay? That's not going to last millions, 65 million years. This little blue line, the top one, okay, is basically if we give the best thing we could give to them and say, okay, we'll give you the longest lasting for collagen, 90,000 years because of its structure, its makeup. But that's just the first line. The stuff we're finding comes from dinosaurs that are 65 times that age more, okay? We also have pigments with melanin and things like that from ink sacs that you can actually reconstitute. They haven't totally broken down, that they actually have drawn pictures with that should not be there. Okay? Just some fascinating finds that are happening. Okay? What is the likelihood that any of those would exist? What kind of a preservation? There's none known. Now, there's been attempts, obviously, but they fail drastically because this is something we can do observable science. We can see the decay rate, and we can work on biomolecules and see what affects them and what doesn't. And we can come to limits of saying this is an impossibility. I guess anything is possible. We could all be, born yesterday and informed by aliens, and as Neil deGrasse Tyson says, part of a computer simulation. But is it reasonable, okay, that these would exist? And so when I look at the 5 points of creation, I think that it's undeniable, creation. Fall and judgment, I think we see that many of the things we find with the dinosaurs that we're observing, obviously because they're not living today, they're from the past, all of them are in flood-buried sediments. Okay? Post-flood historical clashes, some of them may be. It's kind of like the idea of near-death experiences where people try to say that, well, they don't show that there's maybe conscious life after death. Well, you can probably discount most of them, or you could, but when you think about the legitimacy or miracles in that, is one of them, correct. When we think about these, we look at a great accumulation of what seems to be interactions and descriptions and things in literature and things in art that seem to represent animals that they were acquainted with, animals that they associated with. Okay? Then we have the scientific corroboration, radiocarbon footprint showing the entire fossil record. Really, if you're allowed to do the testing on it and you don't take the one scientist's view that no one would do that except an idiotic clown, then you can see that the entire geologic column has carbon-14. It has to be less than our high limit of 100,000 years. And when we come to the scientific corroboration of soft tissue remains, we have even a smaller gap when it comes to that. So with these together, I think that we have exactly. Now in Scripture, it doesn't call them dinosaurs. Again, the word was not there. There's other words that the Bible uses. We have Leviathan. We have other things that mention animals that seem to be different from anything we have today. Okay? But we can truly stand firm. Now we need to be, most of the people I engage with, they truly believe they're right. They're not trying to pull anything over my eyes. They're not trying to, now there are some that for moral reasons they want evolution to be true, and willful reasons. But we need to use questions, we need to talk, we need to engage. There's great sites out there, and I can give you some more information. But now I'll just open it up, and you guys are very good and patient. Sorry for the explosion. Yes. Sorry for the explosion. There we go. I hope yes.
Are there ways to get copies of the slides?
What I can do is let me talk. We just were recently, we had some people try to sue us for our presentations. That's why we put that in there. Let me just talk with somebody, and then what I can do is you guys can message me.
Okay.
Yeah, and then I can send you. The only thing we would ask not to, reproduce them or anything of that nature. Yeah. So, but yeah, I used to always, in all the years that I've done this in the past year, with like my catastrophic flood geology, I just send them out. But, yeah. Yes?
You were talking about yourself as a kid. Is there any research that you said, I wish I would have had that? Because I've got a kid that's in that spot that I wasn't taught about any of this.
Yeah.
And I want to speak up with authority.
Yeah.
I could give them a tool or something that seems...
How old?
9.
9, okay. I would love, call me.
Okay.
Have him call me. And then I can talk about, because there's, the one thing that's hard especially is first knowing where each individual is. Because if you give them too much, then it can overwhelm and then it loses interest, or if it's not enough. But yeah, there's tons of resources out there.
Okay.
Yeah. And there's a lot of both video and book accompaniments. So like if they like videos, there's one video called evolution's Achilles heel, and it's more negative argumentation than positive, but it has a book. So what could happen is, he could watch a video if you wanted to read the book that would deal with a lot of that. So you can kind of couple those things together.
Well, as like in ministry, there's a lot of kids that don't have this exposure. So
No.
like, if I'm gonna partner with somebody or I want to have a resource, there are a lot of these I've used before, but sometimes they're really hard to navigate. Of like, okay, I'm gonna break this down.
Well, it's interesting. Michael Behe, who wrote Darwin's Black Box, and he's wrote The Edge of Evolution and some other things, he actually went through, he was in postdoctoral work, and he said it was 2 students in his class that started asking questions. Maybe, what do you do with a dinosaur? He said he was so furious because he was a post-grad and he didn't know what they were asking. He was unaware. He had never been taught some of those things. And that's what started his quest. So even when I go in and I teach at a college level, I'll have people argue with me and say, that must be false. That's not true. And I'll give them the secular papers and say, this isn't. We may have a different interpretation, but the finds are there, and this is what it is. So really, when it comes to dinosaurs, I think the overwhelming proof, if you accumulate it all together, is that it's not that old, and they were with us, and yeah.
My wife is a public school 7th grade science teacher.
Hey!
Do you have resources that would be acceptable in a public school setting?
I do know, like that genetics book I was talking about, he has a school book that takes out some of...
If you give me your email, I'll
Yeah,
email you.
dude, that'll be, and I can look, and there are good resources out there. There's good books that are just like on the topic, but then do offer ideas of what about this, that they can, look through and ask. Do they... Yeah, it's so funny anymore with the public schools. But yeah, email me and I'll look through and see what we can find. I left it in the car, but I'll grab it. Yeah.
I would say, what's the best way to contact you?
Oh, thank you. You guys too.
And you guys get a spelling then too. Man, I'd have funked that part. We did it about 2 years ago too.
I think it's either 2 or 3 years ago.
Yeah. I looked at that when I said, I didn't come back.
Yeah.
This one seems to be more in depth than the last one.
I've added quite as I go along and stuff, and I try to keep it.
Well, we have I work at a daycare part-time. Center, and we had one young gal, 19, that didn't believe in God.
Yeah.
She was raised by a drug addict mom and never went to church. So I had her teach a theology class one time.
Right.
And philosophy of religion.
Yeah.
And I used a Big Bang theory. And I had.
Thank you.
I had my kids do a model car. And I taped it, and I showed it, and I said that was God, good orderly direction. And I had a middle linebacker put all pieces in a bag, and I blew it up. And then when I said Big Bang Theory, it went smashing all over, and it went all over the classroom. And then I says, well, then how long you take to get that model car back together and look like this one? And they said, well, never. I said, there's your Big Bang Theory. What do you think?
How do you like that one?
I just did it to that young gal, and she said, "Wow, I never thought of that."
Yeah, actually, it was questions about creation and that the priest actually started asking me, and he was asking me to, okay, now give me your evidences and proofs for that, and I was like, wow, I haven't evaluated mine as much.
Well, the first thing I knew was you were going to try to prove the Bible wrong, and then you end up proving it right.
Well, I do.
Yep. That's the first time I heard.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
It's good hearing you.
I really appreciate it.
Oh, good. Thank you. I hope it was beneficial.
Oh, definitely.
Okay, awesome. Yeah.
Thank you so
Hi.
much.
Oh,
This
you're
was great.
welcome.
I came down
Good.
just to hear you this week.
Oh,
I
thank
live
you.
in the area, but
Oh,
glad I got to hear
good.
the dinosaur one.
Oh, good. I hope it was worthwhile then.
Absolutely.
Okay.
My
Okay, good.
father-in-law, who's now 91,
Yeah.
did what the family affectionately called dinosaur hunting.
Oh.
In Arizona, looking
Wow.
for footprints of humans and dinosaurs in
Together.
the same rock strata and published about it.
Oh, cool. Do you have any copy of his monograph? Or?
Probably my husband does, but that's why I was like, let me get your email.
Yeah, that'd be fascinating.
Yeah.
Oh,
And-
because I know they've looked at some deer down in some of the areas in Texas,
Yes.
and there's debates going back and forth. But yeah, it's fascinating to study.
Yeah, and this is up on Indian land, so he had to get permits to go
Oh, wow.
and see it.
And they allowed him.
Yeah.
My son has his, he's just finishing with his degree in archaeology, and he primarily focuses on Native American, and he says it's becoming so hard now to do a lot of the studies because there have been some recent things that have shown some cannibalism. And he says it's been, so yeah,
Yeah.
I'm glad he got on there.
Yeah, it was great. It was great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so
Oh,
much. for doing
thank
that.
you. Yeah.
When people come up and say, how come we don't find human remains from the flood with the dinosaurs and other things? What's your simple...
Most of the time we talk about, there's different what we call fossilization ratios, like what's the likelihood of something being fossilized. We also would look as if the flood model is correct, probably humans are the most agile to be able to avoid to survive the longest. In many places, you'll see that like on the eastern U.S., you have over 20,000 feet of sediments that is now the continental shelf that was denuded. So some of those last layers would have been gone. And also the number of fossils that we have.
There are some instances where they found human remains in coal beds.
Oh, yeah. And we found human remains elsewhere, just not together with dinosaurs.
There's another resource. It's Genesis History.
Yeah, it's a great site.
They've got a YouTube channel,
And by...
there's one guy that's talking to a geologist, and he's looking at like the Little Grand Canyon.
Oh, yeah, Mount St. Helens.
Yep.
Yeah, Mount St. Helens.
Yep.
Made in a week.
Yeah, looks the whole world like it's old.
If you dated it by conventional means, it would be millions.
It would seem millions in the river. So there's a lot of different ways in that aspect
The
to say,
statistics alone
right?
say
Yep.
you're
Well,
not
people
gonna-
don't realize that when we look at the fossil record itself. 99% is sea life and vegetation, or 95% is sea life and vegetation. Less than 5% is vertebrate. And so I don't know if you remember when I showed you some of those trees, they had the numbers of fossils. And so some of those family lines they have only 230, somewhat complete fossils of that animal.
Yeah,
And
that's convincing right there.
Oh, it is. Yeah. So, hey, have a good one. Hi. Oh, you're here for this.
Yes. So you're going next, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
You're familiar. You already
Yes.
got it down. Cool.
So just record it on here again,
yeah,
or
so
just
record
stop it
and
now?
Stop. Same